Chapter 45. Harpies Underground. The sound of their footsteps echoed as they ventured deeper into the dark caves. Reyes couldn't be certain. There simply wasn't enough light to be sure, but he thought that they were moving along some kind of man-made passage rather than any kind of natural cavern. It was wide enough for them to walk three abreast, with Jenni and Tineggi on either side of him. They continued into the caverns for about 20 feet. By then, the amount of light reaching them from the mouth of the cave was so little that Reyes couldn't even see Tineggi standing right next to him. Her grey body seemed to merge with the rock walls. "I can't see a thing," Reyes commented, stopping still for a moment. "Me neither," Libnah agreed. It sounded as if she was right behind him, and a moment later she brushed lightly against his wings. "Just give me a moment," Reyes requested. "I'll fix it." "Don't bother," Mangloss's voice came from somewhere just behind Reyes. "Hand me my staff, would you?" "Your staff?" Reyes repeated uncertainly. It felt strange trying to talk to someone who he knew was there and yet couldn't see. "But you're a minotaur. What happens if someone sees you down here with a mage's staff? It's likely to raise far too many questions." "We're inside the cave now," Mangloss explained. "Considering how much trouble we had getting in here, I would assume that we aren't really supposed to be here. Since anyone we meet here would know that we aren't supposed to be here, I think our mere presence puts us well beyond the point where we would have to answer awkward questions. Now, give me my staff." "I think he's right," Libnah commented. She had taken a step back after nearly colliding with Reyes. "If we're caught down here, we're going to be in trouble anyway. You might as well give him his staff." Reyes shrugged his shoulders, although with his own body grey in the darkness, it was a wasted gesture. Then he pulled Mangloss's staff free from the hammerstone. "Okay, here you go." Where are you?" "Right here," the old mage replied. Reyes held the staff out in the general direction of Mangloss's voice. He felt the staff vibrate as if someone had made a grab for it and failed. On the second attempt, though, the staff was grasped firmly and Reyes let go of it. Reyes was still looking roughly in Mangloss's direction when a sudden flare of light almost blinded him. Mangloss was now using his staff like a torch, with the handle shining like a beacon. The light shone brightly on the nearby walls, revealing that the passage they were in was indeed man-made. There were clear indications of chisel marks on the wall. By the look of it, there had once been a lot of light supplied down here. There were lanterns hanging from the walls at roughly 10-foot intervals on both sides of the passage. They must have needed the place lit for something. But now, every one of the lanterns was unlit. "I thought I could smell oil," Anida commented dryly. "Let's press on," Libnah suggested. She rubbed her eyes and blinked a couple of times as her eyes adjusted to the light coming from Mangloss's staff. Then she glanced briefly over her shoulder to indicate those who were guarding the mouth of the cave, adding, "Before they see the light and begin to get suspicious." They pressed on along the passage. Mangloss, with his illuminated staff, took the lead. It wasn't a powerful light, but it served its purpose in this passage, lighting the way ahead clearly for about 10 feet. The passage continued on straight for a good 100 yards. It looked pretty much the same for the entire length. The entire population of First Town, Loughton, and Arliss forced out of their homes and shipped over here for this purpose. 1 million or more slaves, all forced to work for the greater glory of the Elven Emperor, Jenni commented. "We saw some of them outside, but I wonder what happened to the others." "You couldn't get 1 million in here," Libnah commented. "There's no way they could have done all this," Mangloss insisted. "Not even with 1 million slaves. Not in a mere 4 months. I suspect magic was involved." "I wish I knew what you people were talking about," Tineggi muttered coldly. "I feel as if I'm being left out most of the time." "Sorry," Reyes replied, "but you have to understand. You are the only one of our group that doesn't speak Flourish, whereas neither Anida nor Mangloss are able to converse in our language. It makes sense for us to use Flourish." Mangloss gave Gagara a trinket that enables her to communicate with anyone. "Maybe he can do the same thing for you, if only temporarily, with a little bit of magic." "If it will help me to understand what you and the others are talking about," Tineggi replied, "then how could I refuse?" Reyes stopped and turned towards Mangloss. He explained the problem. "Tineggi doesn't speak Flourish. Can you do anything to help?" Mangloss nodded and stepped forward. "This won't last long," he said, and tapped Tineggi gently on the shoulder with the iron shoe of his staff. Tineggi, uncertain of the mage's intent, suddenly unsheathed her claws and looked menacingly back at him. "Do you understand me now?" Reyes asked. Tineggi sheathed her claws again and gave Reyes a strange look. "Of course. But then we already know I understand the harpy tongue." "I'm speaking Flourish," Reyes explained. No, Tineggi responded, you're... Then realisation seemed to strike her. Oh. Reyes offered her a quick reassuring smile and then said, come on, let's move. From its starting point at the mouth of the cave, the passage extended for what was slightly more than 100 yards. At the very end of the passage was a very large cave. As they stepped from the passage into the cave, the light from Mangloss's staff proved totally inadequate to the task. At best, it illuminated the walls on either side of the passage they had just emerged from, and a small part of the floor in front of them. It was as if they were standing on a small island of light, while the unknown features of an ocean of darkness flowed all around them. Great, Tineggi said. I can't see a thing. Easily fixed, Mangloss replied. He lifted his staff up a little higher, extending the range of the circle of light by a tiny modicum. Then he poured more energy into the spell. Suddenly the lumen output of the mage's staff increased many-fold. It was so far across the other side of the cavern that whatever lay on the far side was still cast in darkness. But the staff did now illuminate a lot more of the cave than it had. Can you make it brighter? Libnah asked. I can, Mangloss replied. But if I do, you must all be careful not to look at the source of the light. It might blind you. Do it, Libnah suggested. Reyes? Jenni? Mangloss asked. Reyes nodded. Let's see what we have. Mangloss poured even more power into the staff. The pool of light inched slowly across the rest of the cave until it finally hit the far wall. Then the light climbed halfway up that wall before stopping. Reyes looked across the cavern with shock. This place was huge. It was hard to judge just how big a cave it was. Reyes would estimate that the far wall from where he was standing was at least half a mile away, but it might be even further. One thing Reyes found hard to ignore was just how perfectly circular the cavern seemed to be. This is all artificial, Reyes commented. It's all man-made. It looks as if they were searching for something, Jenni suggested. Look at all the side passages. There were a myriad number of side passages leading away from the edges of this cave. The passages struck out in all directions, although most of them seemed to be concentrated towards the south of the cavern rather than any of the other three cardinal points. Regardless of which way it pointed, though, each of the passages had roughly the same dimensions as those of its neighbours. These passages had all been chiselled out by slaves. As well as all the passages around the perimeter of the cave, there were three that headed downwards. These three started somewhere in the middle of this large cavern, and at first looked like nothing more than a huge gaping holes in the floor. So, where do we go now? Jenni asked. Which passage to pick? We'll be here all day checking them all, Reyes replied. Maybe we should each take one and report back here after 5 minutes or so. Mangloss grumbled a little uncertainly. I'm not sure I like the idea of us splitting our forces. Me neither, Libnah offered. Remember, I told Gress that we had important information for the leader of the army, and had assumed that he was inside the cave. Gress didn't correct me. So you're saying that their leader is in here somewhere? Jenni asked. If what is in here is so important to the Elven war effort, Tineggi suggested, then it's only reasonable to assume that it would be well guarded. Assuming it's still here, Anida offered. Libnah nodded. The thing is, I'd hate to think of any of us meeting him alone, especially as it's unlikely he would also be alone. So, Jenni asked, which passage would you suggest? Libnah looked at the caves and then said, I think it would be best if we stuck together. We should choose a passage at random, and if it turns up nothing, we head back here and try again. It would be nice if we had a way to mark the passages we'd checked, Jenni commented. This really could take us all day, Reyes muttered. I doubt I have all day, Mangloss responded. Reyes looked towards Libnah. Okay, why don't you pick a passage? Libnah looked around at the passages. The most logical pattern to follow would be to check out the next passage to our left. However, I think it's highly unlikely to be the one we're looking for. It would be pretty much just take us back towards the pit. I guess that makes sense, Mangloss commented. Libnah led the others slowly around the centre of the cave and checked out the 3 passages there. 2 of them were pointed to the south, and the third back towards the east. What are you thinking? Reyes asked. There aren't many passages to the north or west, Libnah said, looking at those sides of the cave. My guess is that what they're looking for is relatively large, and there isn't enough of the island left in either of those directions. We can't be certain, though, Mangloss commented. No, Libnah agreed. We can't be certain. Pick one, Reyes requested. I'm thinking, Libnah said. I'm considering where this thing the elves are looking for might be. Here we have 3 passages heading down. When were they dug? Did the elves order that they be opened because they couldn't find what they were looking for on this level? Or were they dug at the same time as the others? This is all guesswork, Anida commented. It is, Libnah agreed. I could be wrong, but I think these tunnels were opened after all the others. That would suggest that none of the other passages leads to where the elves wanted. If you're right, that would cut our search down considerably, Jenni offered. If she's right, Anida commented. Libnah looked at the archmage. I don't suppose you have any magic that could tell us which of these tunnels was the last to be dug? I don't, Mangloss said. Sorry. Look, Anida said. It's all very well to think that you understand the workings of an elf's mind, but remember that they had something like 1,000,000 slaves to cut all these passages out for them. Don't you think it likely that they would do it all at the same time? They weren't exactly short on manpower. Libnah hesitated, looking at Anida. You're probably right. She looked back at the tunnels leading down. I still think it's one of these, though. Then pick one, Anida suggested. Don't lay an egg, sweetie, I'm thinking about it, Libnah commented. There are 2 passages heading south and another one to the east. But why? She didn't wait for a reply. She made her choice and began to head down into the passage that headed east. It was another long passage, and at first it descended at quite a steep gradient. After a short while the passage began to level out a little. Once again it was a long straight passage with the telltale chisel marks on the wall that revealed how the tunnel had been created. Once again unlit lanterns lit the sconces on the walls every 10 feet or so. The light they had was still being generated by Mangloss and his staff. Since they were back in a relatively narrow passageway, Mangloss had returned the lumen output of his staff to a much more manageable level. I hope this is the right direction, Jenni commented. Me too, Libnah replied. I think we must be heading directly under the pit, Mangloss offered, after they had been walking for a fair while. We're immediately under what had once been the city of Arlis, Libnah offered. Yes, I think we're on the right track. I wish I knew what we were looking for, Reyes commented. Harpies underground, Tineggi complained. It's just not natural. They continued along the passage for another 50 yards or so, and then Libnah suddenly called to them to stop. What is? Jenni started to say. Shush, Libnah commanded. Keep low. She turned to face Mangloss. Quick, douse the light. Mangloss's staff faded to a mere glow, and then the group were thrown into almost total darkness. There was light coming from somewhere up ahead. It was a long way ahead, and barely visible to Reyes from where he was standing. But it was there. What is it? Anida whispered. I can't hear anything. Shush, Reyes hissed for Anida to remain quiet. The thing was, Anida might not be able to hear anything, but Reyes could. There were voices coming from somewhere not too far up ahead. These voices echoed a little around the passage and were quite audible to the 3 harpies. What confused Reyes most was that whoever it was that was speaking in flourish. Did you hear something? Hear what? I thought I heard something. I heard nothing. The conversation continued very much in this vein for a short while. Then the subject seemed to change. Reyes wasn't certain, but he thought he could hear at least 10 distinctly different voices. There were possibly more. What do we do? Reyes hissed. We have to take them, Libnah replied in a soft voice. I think they prove we're on the right lines. I'll take them, Anida whispered. She unsheathed her sword and held it firmly. Not alone you won't, Jenni commented as quietly as she could muster. My orders are to protect you, my queen, Anida pointed out, her voice also very quiet. You can't do that if you're dead, Jenni responded, perhaps a little louder than intended. Look, Reyes said, trying to defuse the situation and summoning his sword from the hammerstone. We'll all go. Tineggi rested a hand lightly on Reyes' shoulder. You should stay here at least. We'll all go, Reyes replied calmly. Libnah continued to make her way slowly along the passage. The others followed close behind her. Before he moved, Reyes used his cat sight spell so that he could see where he was going without having to risk colliding with those who had pushed on in front. There wasn't a lot of ambient light for the spell to catch hold of, but it enabled him to see enough that he was able to make out the shapes of the others. Reyes couldn't help but wonder, as he watched her walk without hesitation along the passage, just how Libnah was able to manage so easily in all this gloom. Then he turned and saw Tineggi still by his side. He rested a hand lightly on her shoulder and said, Let me guide you. Thanks, boss, Tineggi replied. Together they moved closer to the end of the passage. There was another cavern there. It was well lit, revealing to Reyes and those he was with quite a bit about what was awaiting them. It was a much smaller cave than the last one, It looked as if it was being used as some kind of dormitory, and there were bunk beds placed at regular intervals around the smooth outer walls, although the main feature of the cage was a long thin table placed right at the very centre. It was a table covered with food, at which the occupants of this place were sitting, feasting. The chairs had been specially made for the feasters, allowing room for both their wings and tails. The occupants were harpies. This cave was evidently serving as a kind of guard station. From his position in the passage, Reyes could see 2 other passages leading away, and assumed that there would be at the very least one other in the part of the cavern he couldn't see. Even from here, Reyes could smell something foul coming from the nearest of the passages he could see. It was distant and almost indistinct. Reyes could almost imagine that after living here a while, someone might easily get used to such a smell. They were speaking flourish, Anida commented with surprise at the sight. Shush, Libnah warned. At the table, one of the harpies glanced round towards the passage. Then she got out of her chair and began to approach it. Anida did her very best to meld with the nearest shadows. Libnah looked around at those with her, and then she looked back at the approaching harpy. The time for subtlety is past. Attack! And with that she charged out of the end of the passage. She grabbed the approaching harpy about the midriff and used her leverage to force her opponent back onto the floor. Reyes, sword in hand, rushed out of the passage, but he didn't do so alone. Anida and Jenni were right on his tail, with Mangloss and an uncertain-looking Tineggi bringing up the rear. Libnah broke the neck of her opponent within a couple of seconds, and then she was soon on her feet again and looking for another target. The room broke into a general melee. Although the harpies were stronger than any of the humans, Reyes didn't fear for his sister or her friend. He had seen how they could both handle a sword, and had even been on the receiving end once or twice when training with them. As strong as the harpies were, they were no match for such swordplay. Mangloss didn't even try to fight them. He just made the occasional mystic sign when one of the harpies looked in his direction, and a moment later that harpy would fall asleep on the cavern floor. Strangely, perhaps, the one Reyes was most concerned about was Tineggi. She had nothing except her claws to fight with, and claw against claw, her chances would normally be considered a little better than average, accepting that Tineggi was considered one of the best huntresses in her village. The odds, however, seemed to be much higher on the bodyguard's side because, as Tineggi said after dispatching her third opponent, I don't think much of these huntresses. It's as if they haven't been taught to fight properly. I noticed that, Libnah agreed. I don't get it, Anida commented. She cut and jabbed and another opponent fell to the floor. They spoke flourish. There were harpies who spoke flourish and only flourish at my wedding, Jenni commented, lopping the hand off of one of her opponents. The harpy screamed and fled towards one of the side passages leading away from this cavern. They were working for Klemper.